Thank you for tuning in for today's episode of Stranger Than Fiction. And as usual, I am joined by Stan Barabbas, and today we are continuing our series about revealing hidden history, and we are both joined once again by Ralph Ellis. Now, in case you didn't see that first four-part interview that was 3 hours, 40 minutes long, we're going to have that link down below and above, and I encourage you to check out that interview. It's definitely a precursor to what we're going to be talking about in today's interview, but it's not a requirement that you watch it to be able to catch up. This particular second interview with Ralph Ellis is going to be broken up into two parts, and this is part number one. So after you're done with this part, make sure you're checking out the second one, and I do encourage you to check out that first interview we did with Ralph Ellis that is 4 parts because it does give a lot of information that leads into this. But again, it's not required, but I definitely recommend it. Now, if this is your first time ever watching any of my videos, I do encourage you to explore my channel. Make sure you subscribed, smash that like button, hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date with my videos as they come out. I encourage everybody to check out my Patreon channel. Not only do I post up exclusive content, early access as well, it's a way to support what I do directly. And be sure to follow me on Library, my official backup channel, where I post up extra content. And we're just going to go ahead and get right into today's show. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Barabbas and Rice Show. And today we are continuing our Revealing Hidden History series, and we are joined once again by author, historian, Ralph Ellis. Now, he's actually been on the show before. We did a 4-part interview that turned out to be 3 hours and 40 minutes long, and we're going to have that link down below and above, and I definitely encourage people to check it out, but it's not required to watch this particular episode. We're going to be getting into Arthurian legend. And before we pass it over to Ralph, we're just going to kind of go around and say how we're doing. So, Stan, how's everything been?
Been really good. Just another day watching things unfold. Trying to fill in the blanks with history, and that's why we have Ralph here today.
I love the fact that we have this opportunity just to be able to talk to Ralph about the things that he's been learning and sharing with his books. So it's been about a month since we talked. Ralph, how's everything been?
Yeah, busy doing other things, but still researching, still doing a lot of work on Facebook and YouTube, which keeps me busy. Yeah, no new books on the horizon, but the one we're going to talk about today is the Grail Cipher, which is my opus on Arthurian legend. It started out as a chapter or two on Arthurian legend, and it turned out to be 600 pages. So
Wow.
Sorry about that, readers, but there we go. There was a lot of detail to cover in that particular book.
So you mentioned it's a book, and how can people who might be unfamiliar with you, and we'll talk more about it and we'll have it linked down below for people as well, but I want people to know at the beginning of the video, you are an author, you have a lot of books available. How can people find you on the internet and purchase your books?
Well, my website is edfu books, which is edfu-books.com or .uk, I think it is. So that's got everything on there. I don't keep books myself now, so I'm using pretty much all Amazon. So best to go on to Amazon for the books, and they have obviously the tablets and the paperbacks. Try to get the 2017 or better editions, because there are some very old editions still knocking around on Amazon, but they were all the books were pretty much revised in 2017, and they've got the sort of latest data in them, which is good to get. So yes, and I've got a YouTube. I don't know how you can link to the YouTube. Anyway, it'll be in the link somewhere. I've got a YouTube channel with various.
If people search your name, it'll
doesn't always come up on a search, so they'll probably have to look in your links to find that. So yeah, they're fairly good. Lots of people like those.
YouTube likes to censor people, and it really sucks, man, because especially when you're trying to get truth out there or some variation of the truth. And I really respect what you're doing as a revisionary theologist. I really like the idea of taking events of the Bible and replacing them back in history. I think that's such a wonderful subject, and it's very attracting to me to talk about these kind of things, to stay open-minded, because I just don't feel like what we've been taught is true, like we mentioned before.
So
Stan.
And same with Arthurian legend, as we're going to see in a minute. The same problems happen there too.
Well,
So Ralph, where we ended up last time was we kind of left the audience with the cliffhanger of I asked you the question of where through your research you thought Jesus was buried, and you had mentioned Stonehenge.
And then Ralph said that it's probably you're not gonna get the answer to that maybe in this episode, because there's a lot of information that has to be gone through before we get to that point. So you still might be hanging on the cliff.
And it's a very high cliff too.
So Ralph, you want to go ahead and lead us into the beginning of that revelation?
Yes. Arthurian legend. Now, how did I get there? Well, I'd been doing all of this research, and I mean, this research has been going on for decades. I've already written, 10 books on the subject. And while I was doing it, I kept getting these sort of little pointers towards Arthurian legend, which I didn't, at the time, I didn't know that much about. And it just looked so interesting that I thought, I'd better go and research this, because there's a lot of information there to find out. So, I took 2 years off from work, and I just went down to Spain, and I researched Arthurian legend for 2 years. And
did you hang out in caves by any chance?
Not in any caves.
Sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
Yes, you'll have to look at the previous talks to find out about that one. Yeah, no, it was just a standard flat. It was quite nice. On the beach, though, it was quite nice. And so I immersed myself in Arthurian legend, and I found out that rather like the New Testament and the Old Testament, the story we have been given is not the truth. It's quite a long way from the truth. And so badly given to us in academia, not just lay researchers who do their research into Arthurian legend, but serious academics, the modern ones especially, have got it completely wrong, and they don't give you the full information. And I was very disappointed to see how badly they were reporting the facts about Arthurian legend. So, well, let's go back to the beginning, I suppose, because this is the biggest heresy, I suppose, is there is no King Arthur. And that's a big shock to many people, because we all know the story. We've seen the films, we've read the books, we know this King Arthur character. We know he exists in history, but he doesn't. He's not there. So if we go back to the beginning, the first, he's supposed to be a Dark Age king. So we're talking, they say 500s AD, up to some of the, if you read the reference books, up to 620 BC, Dark Age Britain. This is when, after the Roman Empire had collapsed in Britain, the Roman Empire collapsed in 415, I think I say, if I remember correctly. And Britain entered a dark age at that point. Everything collapsed. There was no society. All the towns were disbanded. There were no roads. All of the infrastructure that the Romans made collapsed. And then at the end of the 400s, 490 roughly, the whole of the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And so there were no Romans at all at that point. The whole of Europe dissolved into chaos. So this is the time we're talking of. And that is when King Arthur is supposed to have been around. He's supposed to have been a Dark Age king, somewhere around the 500s, anywhere up to 600 AD. But the trouble is, the history is sparse because it is the Dark Ages, but the historians of that era don't mention King Arthur. So we have people like Gildas, who was maybe the first, he's 6th century, ruin and conquest of Britain, and he doesn't mention King Arthur. And then we have Bede, the Venerable Bede, he's sort of 8th century, and he doesn't mention King Arthur. So, for the very scribes and chroniclers who were there at the time, at pretty much the time of King Arthur, don't mention him, which is a bit odd, This
Extremely.
famous king, this big, powerful court, all these famous characters, and nobody mentions him. And we can go on to Nennius, who wrote a history of the Britons, 9th century. There is no King Arthur. There is a mention of maybe a warrior called Arthur, literally in one sentence, but there is no King Arthur, there is no court, there is no Guinevere, Lancelot, all that big story we know about, the court of Camelot, just simply doesn't exist.
What about Merlin?
None of them exist. Absolutely
I'm
none.
sad now because I really like Merlin.
Well, he exists later on.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Is like, I guess
this time he doesn't.
This has to be based off some sort of truth. It just, again, I guess with what you were doing with the conversations before with the Bible, it's just displaced in a different period of time, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It's displaced. And we can tell that because of the time that it appears. So we go all the way through to the 12th century, and William of Malmesbury, in his first book, Chronicle of the English Kings, doesn't mention the King Arthur story. Huntington, again, early 12th century, doesn't mention the King Arthur story. So, and these are quite large, comprehensive chronicles of England at that time, and they don't mention the King Arthur story. And then suddenly, very, very suddenly, 1135, roughly, we think, we get Geoffrey of Monmouth and Walter of Oxford. And suddenly, we get the complete Arthurian story. And it appears from nowhere in the early 12th century. Question is, why does it suddenly appear at that point? And it was a very small coterie of people who knew about this story. Because we get to William of Newburgh, and he came later. He's sort of 1160s. And what does he say? So we've already had the Arthurian story from Geoffrey of Monmouth. And then Newburgh, who writes again a very comprehensive history of England. It's called The History of English Affairs, about 1160 AD. And he says, no one but a person ignorant of ancient history can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently Monmouth falsifies in every respect. Whatever Geoffrey has written is a fiction invented either by himself or others and promulgated either through unchecked propensity to falsehood or a desire to please the Britons. He's talking about Monmouth's history of King Arthur here. And then he goes on, he says, for how would the elder historians, who were ever anxious to omit nothing remarkable, and even recorded trivial circumstances past, how could they pass by unnoticed so incomparable a man and such surpassing deeds as King Arthur? How could they, I repeat, by their silence, suppress Arthur, a British monarch who was superior to Alexander the Great?
Ralph,
you see the problem.
Let me ask you a question. How important is the Knights Templar involvement in this? Because it seems wherever they're involved, there's some altercations in history, and the Knights Templar, if I'm correct, leads to the Vatican.
Yeah, well, you've got it in one, haven't you? That's the problem. There is no King Arthur, and William of Newburgh confirms that, the vast majority of people, even in this early era, don't know anything about King Arthur. He did not exist. But we get this story from Monmouth and Oxford in 1135, all about this wonderful King Arthur character. So where did that story come from? Well, it's not a British story, because we don't get it from Britain. Everybody thinks King Arthur is British. But the only place that we get no stories about Arthur at all is Britain. So the story from Monmouth and Oxford came from Brittany, and it came from Normandy. And if you look at all the Arthurian manuscripts, because there's loads and loads of manuscripts out there, but they come from Sweden, from Holland, from Greece, from Italy, loads from northern France, of course. You know, the Italian Arthur was buried in Mount Etna. This is a, you know, it's a European-wide character, this King Arthur character. And the earliest sculpture of King Arthur, where do you think the earliest sculpture of King Arthur would be? And this is very early, this is 12th century. Where do you think that would be?
I would think
Well,
England.
You would, but it's actually on the doorway of Modena Cathedral in northern Italy.
Northern Italy, okay.
And that's the first sculpture we have of King Arthur and his knights and Queen Guinevere. It's the whole scene from Arthurian legend, and it's in Italy. So we have a European-wide story, not a British story, and it appears in 1135. So what ties all of that together? Well, as you said, what ties it together is the Knights Templar. And the reason it appears at that time is due to the Crusades. So the first crusade goes off in 1096. The first crusade to the east, led by Count Baldwin of Boulogne, and it heads off east, and it gets to Antioch, which is on the corner of the Mediterranean, way up in the, you know, the northeast corner of the Mediterranean, and it gets to Antioch there, and it doesn't turn right and go down to Jerusalem to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim oppression. It carries straight on, and it goes due east across the Euphrates, and it goes to Edessa. So the first city that was liberated during the first crusade was the city of Edessa.
By the Knights Templar.
Well, the Knights Templar hadn't been invented at that point. They were another 10 years before
Okay.
they were invented. But these were the first crusaders. And if anyone has already seen the previous videos we've done, we talk about this city of Edessa quite a lot because I link it into the biblical story. So the first city that was liberated from Muslim oppression was Edessa. And you have to ask yourselves, why did the Crusaders go to Edessa? Why did Count Baldwin, you know, this French guy, go to Edessa and not to Jerusalem? Well, the answer was there were some secrets there.
Yeah.
If you wanted to get some secrets about biblical history, you really wanted to go to the first Christian city, because the first Christian city that was ever established was the city of Edessa. And that's where they went to. And so what I concluded, I mean, this was the end of my conclusions after going through all of this information in that book, The Grail Cipher, that I wrote. The end conclusion had to be that the information was brought back from the East by the Knights Templar. Because the Knights Templar, when were they? I think they were established in 1119 and they were ratified in 1129. And so just 6 years later, we get Monmouth and Oxford writing their, what did he call it? The History of the Kings, which gives the whole of the Arthurian story. So this story appears to have come back from the East with the Crusaders. And you might say, well, you know, that doesn't make sense. That's not possible. How can that be? Well, that's only because really people have not opened their eyes to the possibilities with Arthurian legend, because Arthurian legend is not really as has been advertised. And the worst of these, I think the worst, the most interesting of these, is High History, which was written, when was that written? That was, it was written after William of Newburgh, so it would be about 1170 AD. And it's High History, which is an anonymous manuscript, but it's a very early one. And it's a very dark history of King Arthur. It's very different to all of the other histories. It says, you know, that King Arthur was the most evil king in the world. Yeah, it's that sort of history.
Wow.
It's looking at things from the opposite point of view. And the trouble is with High History and with History of the Holy Grail, which is a later one from the Vulgate cycle, is it contains heresies. And the biggest heresy that these manuscripts embody is their authorship. And the real troubling fact is that these manuscripts say that Arthurian legend was written by Josephus Flavius.
Okay.
And that's a problem.
I'd almost like to time travel and just slap that dude around, man.
It's a problem, and it's a problem that's glossed over because people don't understand the history, and it's troubling. You know, you cannot have this story written by Josephus Flavius. It's not possible. And so you get people like William Neitz, who's the father, I suppose, of Arthurian research. I mean, he's 19th century. And I have to say, these 19th century researchers were far better than anyone who comes out of modern academia. They knew their stuff. They researched this. They made it their life study. And you get a lot of good information out of them. It's a little bit swayed by Christian thinking sometimes, of course, so you have to do some interpolation sometimes, but they really did know their stuff. And they reported it. Even if they didn't quite understand it and found it troubling, they would still sort of report it. So you do get a better sense of what's going on if you read these early researchers. So Neitz says of this problem, because we have these two people, this is another thing we need to talk about before we go on to this. The hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. This is why you get this story about Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain, and somehow that's linked into the Arthurian story, but we're not quite sure why, you know, but everyone understands that it's something to do with, you know, Glastonbury and all that sort of business. So when you read Arthurian history, a lot of it has to do with Joseph of Arimathea, which again is a slightly troubling aspect. And then you read High History, and what does it say? It says that Percival, who's one of the knights of the Round Table, he becomes the senior knight of the Round Table, was the nephew of Joseph of Arimathea. Well, that's a problem for the start. And then the Fisher King, the first of the Fisher Kings, we have this line of Fisher Kings, he owned the donkey that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea.
The one that Jesus supposedly in the Bible wrote in.
Yeah, but we're back in the 1st century here. So, you know, Joseph of Arimathea being the guy who took Jesus down from the cross. So all the time we're looking at this, we're pushing the story back into the 1st century. Even if we don't want to, it's being pushed for us way back into the 1st century. And then High History comes along and says that the manuscript was written by Joseph of Arimathea. So William Neitz says of this, he says, what does he say? He says, the role of Josephus Flavius is of greater importance in this work than that of Joseph of Arimathea. It is Josephus to whom we owe the tale, and he is known as the good scribe and the good hermit. Twice the text calls him simply Joseph, and twice he is called Josephus. It is now generally supposed that the confusion between these two Josephs, Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, gave rise to the mention here of Joseph and his son Josephus, as mentioned above. So yeah, we have two people who were involved in the writing of these texts. One was called Joseph, who is generally believed to be Joseph of Arimathea, and he had a son who was Josephus the good scribe, Josephus Flavius.
Was that really his father and that's really the son?
Well, we don't know, because not according to Josephus Flavius, his father was Matthias.
Okay.
But there is an explanation for this. And there's another historian, again from the 19th century. This is from Ernst Brugger. And he says of this conundrum, because even if Josephus Flavius was very well known as a historian, and even much respected as, I'm going to read this again because I made a mess of that. He says, because even if Josephus Flavius was a well-known historian and even much respected and held as a Christian historian, it remains striking that he could record events from Britannic history that occurred many centuries after his death. I think these oddities are only the result of a confusion. Well, that's what they would have to say, isn't it?
Or he was a time traveler.
Or he was a time traveler.
Yeah, that's an easy answer. Come on, Ralph.
So, I mean, these are the problems that you get when you start deeply researching Arthurian legend and not just reading Monmouth, because if you read Monmouth and Oxford, you don't get all of these conundrums. And I came across a book, I had a bit of an argument with the author, actually. Guy Halsall, he wrote The Worlds of Arthur, and he got a grant for doing this as well. He got a huge grant from some educational establishment. And this book came out at like 130 pages. And I read it, and he never reported on the Vulgate cycle. Now, when there are lots of manuscripts, and the biggest of all these manuscripts is the Vulgate cycle of Arthurian legend, which is 9 volumes and about 5,000 pages of Arthurian legend. I mean, it's just huge. It's an entire library of Arthurian legend. And he had never read Arthurian legend. How can you write a book about King Arthur without reading the Vulgate? You know, it's impossible.
Where is this Vulgate housed?
Well, initially, when I first started this, I had to go to the British Library. And then I found a publisher who did a paperback version. Because, you know, the hardback version is about $1,500, you know. No, it's probably more than that. It's probably about $2,500. Anyway, I picked up a paperback version, which was only $350, because it's a low volume produced book. Well, it's in 9 volumes, and it's huge. The only problem being there is no online version, so you cannot do any searching. So it makes actually working your way through it very slow and cumbersome.
Okay.
So it's a lot of hard work to actually
I was just curious
if
it had any connection like with the Temple Church in London, since that's supposed to be one of the well-known Knight Temple locations.
I don't know where the first manuscripts of the Vulgate cycle were found. But I mean, they're readily available nowadays in the English translation. Mind you, they've only been translated, most of these were translated only about 60 years ago, so fairly recent. Before that, you had to read it in the Latin, because most of these manuscripts were written in the Latin.
Is it a large script? How many pages approximately?
About 5,000 pages.
9 volumes, a total of 5,000 pages.
It's a lot. That's in the that's in the modern script. You know, it would be a lot more than that when written as a manuscript. So yeah, it's bigger than the Bible, that's for sure. And unless you go through that sort of book, you don't find out what Arthurian history is all about. And it's an interesting book, the Vulgate, because it goes off on various tangents. And the tangents were rather interesting because they sort of convinced me that there was a lot of real history here. Because one of the things it tells us in the Vulgate cycle is the history of Pompey the Great. We were talking about Pompey before we came on air.
Yeah, that's crazy how this connects like that.
Yeah, Pompey the Great was the colleague of Julius Caesar, of course, about 50 BC, something of this sort of era. And suddenly, in the middle of Arthurian legend, we get this story of Pompey the Great. What they do is they have these magical ships, and the knights of the Round Table will jump on this magical ship, and it will take them into different eras and different locations, so they can explore these different experiences. And so it talks about the hidden history of Pompey the Great and how he defeated the pirates of the Mediterranean, which is all very true because that's in real history. And then it goes on to say that the pirates had a hideout in Gibraltar at the mouth of the Mediterranean, and how Pompey the Great defeated the pirates at Gibraltar, which is not recorded in real history, that particular element. But the pirates were active around Gibraltar. And then it goes on to intimate the true history of Mithras, because later in Rome we had the religion of Mithras, and Arthurian legend says
Mithra,
that
they call.
Yeah, Mithra, that it didn't come from Mithra in the east. It wasn't the Persian religion.
Okay.
It came from Mithridates VI, who was the king of Pontus that Pompey the Great was fighting in about sort of 50, 60 BC. So it gives a totally different perspective on the birth of Mithras within the Roman Empire. And all of that sort of rings true. And if that's true, it sort of gives you a little bit of confidence that the rest of the story it's talking about is based on some sort of real history. And this is all, in a book about Arthurian legend. It has a lot of these funny diversions. It also tells the story about the floating islands of the Mediterranean, which sort of comes a little bit from Greek history, but it's probably true again. After the eruption of Santorini, this is in 1600 BC, so we're going back a long way here. It appears that there were great pumice islands that were floating around the Mediterranean, because this volcano put out so much pumice, it was 70, 80 meters thick, that this pumice formed a great raft around the island of Santorini, and great chunks of this pumice broke off and started roaming around the Mediterranean all on their own. They were the floating islands of the Mediterranean. And it has this adventure of, the Arthurian knights coming across one of these floating islands. And the description of the floating island is exactly what you would expect of a floating island of pumice that you could actually, it was a couple of kilometers across, it's huge. And you could actually climb onto it and so on. And it was sort of swaying and threatening to tip over in the sea, So again, we get this, very strange story from ancient history stuck in the middle of Arthurian legend. So yeah, it's a very interesting book.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
And for that guy not to include that book and his book
Oh,
about King Arthur just sounds like he wasn't doing a really good job of being a historian.
not a good job at all. I mean, you can't write Arthurian history in 130 pages. I took 600 pages, and I haven't covered all of the aspects, that's for sure.
Fascinating.
I looked up Vulgate cycle. It says here on Wikipedia that the Lancelot Grail, also known as the Vulgate cycle or pseudo-map cycle.
Yes, because it was written by Walter Map, but we're not sure if that's his name. That's why they call him pseudo. Yeah, we have this guy who is supposed to have written it. It reads as though it was written by lots of people, not just one person. There's an awful lot of repetitions in it, as though stories have been duplicated and then folded into all of these different volumes. Yeah, I wouldn't bother reading that because it's impenetrable, it's expensive, you'll never read it. If anyone wants to read this sort of work, the best one is Merlin Grail. So if you look up Merlin Grail, I think it's written by the same person, actually. I think it's written by Walter Map. Let's see if I can find it.
Merlin Grail.
And I definitely want to encourage people to check out, this is the first thing that you're seeing with me and Stan, with Ralph. I would definitely encourage you to check out the previous interviews because it does connect. I mean, you don't have to watch it, but it connects. And if this interests you, you get a little bit more of the insight about this information from that first 4-part interview, the longest interview I'd ever done at that point.
It did go on, didn't it? But it was good. I think
it was great. I totally enjoyed it.
What I found
it was written by Robert de Boron, who also wrote a lot of the Vulgate cycle.
It's got an interesting title, Merlin and the Grail, Joseph of Arimathea, or is that different? Merlin and the Grail, Bold and the Brewer.
They say it came before the Vulgate cycle, but I've read both, and my interpretation is Merlin Grail is a summary of the Vulgate cycle. So if you want to know what's in the Vulgate, the easiest way to do it is read Merlin Grail, which is only like 150 pages, and it gives you a good summary of what it's actually saying there. And it has a lot of interesting things. I mean, it says that Joseph of Arimathea was the traitor who sold Jesus to the Romans. Now that's quite heretical. The traitor is supposed to be Judas, and he's the hated one. And Joseph of Arimathea is the golden boy who takes Jesus down from the cross. He's the hero figure who rides in at the last minute, like Richard I after, the Robin Hood stories. He's supposed to be the hero figure. And yet in Merlin Grail, it's Joseph of Arimathea who sold Jesus to the Romans. And I mean, that's quite heretical. I don't know how quite they got away with that, because this is, 13th century.
Yeah, that's like being burned at the stake kind of stuff.
I was surprised they managed to get away with that and put that in there. But the other thing they say several times is that, how do they word this? That Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius.
And apparently, he's apparently a lot of people he wrote about too, because as you mentioned previous, there's a lot of speculation that he could be the same individual that we know as Saul Paul.
Yeah.
And now Joseph of Arimathea. So like, how many people can this one person be?
Well, yeah, that was a problem when I first suggested this, because we get the same person being multiple characters, but remember, he's a very controversial character. Well, he was the only Jew standing after the fall of Rome. After the fall of Jerusalem. And he was the pet historian and de facto king of Judea. So he could write whatever he wanted to write because there was no one else there to contradict him. But he couldn't include himself under his own name in various texts because he was such a hated and divisive figure. There's no way he could call himself Josephus Flavius, for instance, in the New Testament. It was just not possible. Nobody would ever want Josephus Flavius as being, the primary character who wrote most of the text within the New Testament. And likewise, his arrival at the end of the New Testament, again, you would never want to know that it was Josephus Flavius who took Jesus down from the cross, because that's hugely heretical. It's heretical because A, nobody liked the guy. It's heretical because he was born too late. And so you cannot have Jesus being taken down from the cross in AD 30 by a guy who was only born in AD 37. It's just not possible. And so if you admit that he is Josephus Flavius, you've immediately changed the timeline. And we're back to that chronological chasm that we were
going back to time traveling.
We're going back to time travel again. And there's another reason as well, but I've forgotten it for the minute. But anyway, you can see there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to admit that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius. But of course, we end up with a name like Joseph Arimathea, Arimatheus maybe, and Josephus was called Josephus ben Matthias because his father was known as Matthias. So the name fits, the position fits, and of course Josephus Flavius himself says that he took the leader of the Jewish revolt down from the cross when he was crucified in AD 70. So the actions of Josephus Flavius are exactly the same as Joseph of Arimathea as well. So I would have to go along with this. We get this story where they're continually conflating Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius. And history as we know it seems to bear that out. They seem to be the same character. And again, just as a reminder, we're still talking about Arthurian legend here.
Yeah, that's what's fascinating. So, I mean, in a way, you're connecting this Arthurian legend stuff to the things that we had talked about in regards to the 4-part interview going into the
Yes.
King of Edessa.
Because, and I'm not sure if it's a good point, a good part of this talk to actually introduce it, it's because it's the same story. That's why it's linked.
You just, okay, so then I guess just with you saying that, I'm assuming that you're trying to say that possibly, I mean, are you putting the King Arthur character in the same light as King Isis Manu, the 6th of Edessa?
It's the same character.
Wow. Okay.
Because what happened is that this is why the story only arrives in 1135 AD with the Knights Templar. What happened is there was no such person as King Arthur. But after the Knights Templar, after the Crusaders went on the first crusade, they found a lot of information that had been hidden for an awful long time. So this information had been hidden behind the Council of Nicaea, which is 4th century, and it was hidden behind the Council of Chalcedon, which was 5th century, which split East and West, the Christian church between East and West. It was totally split.
Where the Orthodox Church just come into play, like your Greek Orthodox and your Russian Orthodox Church?
But this is the Syriac Orthodox. So, there was 3, effectively. You've got the Western Catholic Church, you've got the Greek Orthodox Church, and then you've got the Syriac Church. And, of course, the Catholic Church had no control whatsoever over what the Armenian and the Syriac Christians were doing out in the East, because they had been divided completely by the Council of Chalcedon. So they were recording a different history, and they had different texts and manuscripts, and it was a completely separate church. And then, of course, it got locked behind the Iron Curtain of Islam in the 7th century. So Islam invaded all of those regions. Lots of people don't seem to know this. all of these regions were Christian. So all of North Africa, you know, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, they were all Christian. All of the Levant, all of Syria, Jordan, Turkey, modern Turkey, Anatolia, that was all Christian. That was the central part of the Byzantine Empire. And most of Iraq was Jewish, as we touched on the last talk. So that's how it was up until the early sort of 7th century. And then, of course, Islam was invented, and Islam fought its way, you know, by the sword. It conquered all of these lands by the sword, slaughtering everybody as it went. Which is why if you go around looking at the Roman towns around this region, you will see they've all been destroyed. And these towns were destroyed by the people who lived there. They destroyed their own towns. Why? Because they had no walls. Rome was so at peace with itself that most Roman towns had no city walls. And so when these invading armies came across from the east, from Arabia, all they could do was destroy their own towns and make a citadel in the middle that they could hide behind. And most of them didn't actually succeed. They were conquered. So if you go to places like Spitla, which is out in Tunisia, you'll see that they created this very rough citadel in the middle of the town to try and defend themselves. And they actually destroyed the whole of their town. And you know they destroyed their town because all of this citadel is made from the pillars and columns and stones and bricks that, you know, used to make up the town originally. Same if you go to Baalbek over in Lebanon, where they destroyed the whole of the temple in order to make a citadel. Same if you go to Didyma over on the western side of Anatolia. Again, they had the big temple of Didyma there, fantastic big temple, and they destroyed the whole temple to make a huge great wall around it to defend themselves. So the whole of the east at that point was cut off from the Western Byzantine, well, no, not the Western Byzantine, the Western sort of Catholic Empire. It had become, obviously, Rome had gone by that stage. And so it was controlled by the new Catholic emperors. You know, they simply replaced the normal emperors, and the Catholic popes became the new emperors of the Western Roman Empire. And so they had no control whatsoever over the Eastern Christian Church. And they held different traditions over there. And Edessa, of course, was over in the east. It was over by, it was across the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. And so they quite obviously kept some different records, different manuscripts that were not available to the Catholic Church. And it was those manuscripts, it was those genealogies that became available after the First Crusade. And those manuscripts were taken back to where these people came from. So, you know, Count Baldwin of Boulogne came from Boulogne. He was from Normandy, which is where many of these Arthurian texts came from. So they had this new information, but what to do with it? I mean, this was heretical. This was a story of Jesus that we have already uncovered in the previous talks. So this was a Jesus who was the king of Edessa. This was the Jesus who was a real king, a warrior monarch who took on the might of Rome during the Jewish revolt to try and become the next emperor. That's why Jesus was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution, as it says in the Gospel of Matthew.
Right, in regards to Barabbas.
Yeah, but of course it doesn't say what revolution it's talking about. what revolution was there in AD 30 that Jesus would have been jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution?
There weren't any.
There weren't any. The reason being, of course, is that old chronological chasm. We have to go time traveling again. And if we go up into AD 70, of course, the late AD 60s, we find the Jewish revolt, and that's what they were talking about. And the leader of the Jewish revolt, as recorded by Josephus Flavius, although he doesn't do it directly, you have to sort of interpret a little bit. The leader of the Jewish revolt was the kings of Edessa. The kings and the princes of Edessa. We come back to the same city. And so this is what it was talking about. But this was heretical. You couldn't tell that story in the 12th century in Europe. It was just not possible. So you've got two choices. You could maybe tell the story as a history of the kings of Edessa, possibly, but I think even the Catholic Church would rile at that because they probably knew that Edessa was very controversial. Remember, Edessa had been deleted from history. It's not mentioned in any ancient history,
right?
All the way through, almost to the modern era. We only know about it from the Syriac historians and the Armenian historians who recorded the history of Edessa.
And there's coinage and stuff too.
And the coinage, yeah. We have the modern, the coinage that was left from that time. So we know it was a real place. We know these stories from the Syriac historians are true. So what could you do about it with all this new information that you gathered on your crusade across to the east?
You write some story about some crazy thing about a King Arthur, and you put code in it so people can figure out that you're just telling the truth and using this as a way to get the truth out there. But where's the codicy to it then? Like, how do you figure out, like, if they planted information there that we're supposed to figure out, what are we supposed to use as like a template to answer to figure out what they were trying to say specifically? Is there a codex for it? If it's coded?
there is in a way.
Does that make sense?
I go through several of these hints that this is true, that the author was, dropping breadcrumbs to lead people on towards the truth. It's hidden, it's complex, it's not overtly obvious because, well, you got to remember, this was 12th century. For 800 years, nobody has deciphered that this is the true story of Arthurian legend. So it's not something that you can easily decipher, but there are clues left in especially texts like High History that point you in that sort of direction. And I think people all the way through, maybe until the 15th century, probably knew about it. But somehow after that, probably after the dissolution of the Templars, actually, because this was a Templar story, I'm pretty sure of it. And the Templars were all destroyed on Friday the 13th, 1307, which is why Friday the 13th is unlucky for some. And I think a lot of the information was lost at that point. That would be, the beginning of the 14th century.
Some say that, there's that book, Christopher Columbus, The Last of the Templars. So that'd be late 1400s, early 1500s, correct?
So
does he mention this?
What's that?
Does he mention this at all?
Who? Christopher Columbus?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I just was curious when we first spoke. I think it was either ours or Ronnie's videos that I mentioned that I was curious if Christopher Columbus was a Knights Templar, and there's actually
probably
some books that state that he was. I think one of them is Christopher Columbus, the Last Templar. Yeah.
It's rumored that the Templar fleet, because the Templar fleet was based at La Rochelle in Western France, and that disappeared. And it's long been rumored that they actually went to North America because there had been rumors and histories of a continent towards the west if you went far enough. And so it was rumored that the Templar fleet, because there were quite a lot of ships and they were ocean going fairly well, fairly large ships. It's rumored that they sort of went to America, but of course we have no direct information regarding that.
Maybe that was hidden in the Christopher Columbus history.
Well, it could have something to do with it. And of course, all of their wealth disappeared as well. So when the Paris Preceptory was broken into, when they were all rounded up and killed, it was empty. So the treasury of the Knights Templar disappeared. And of course, we don't know what happened to that either.
In the Vatican.
There is a link with Scotland. It's rumored that a lot of them went to Scotland because Scotland was excommunicated at the time, so it was not under the control of the Catholic Church. And so an obvious place to go to would be to Scotland because you would be safe there. Whether they all went there or some went to America, I mean, we end up in mythology at that point. We don't know. But that would be a good time when a lot of this history was lost. Because, the people who created this history, who would have known about it, were all rounded up and either killed or locked away, So it could be that this history was lost at this time.
It's really sad to think that you had to make up a story to try to reveal truth. I think about, and when you said that, it makes me think about like some of the fairy tale Brother Grimm type stuff, like London Bridges and Ring Around the Posies. It's almost, because those were like, when it was told to me, like what some of those things meant, it was almost like trying to keep that history still intact in some way by using limericks and things like that.
Well, I go through some of those as well, because you're right. That's exactly what they were doing. They're trying to keep some of this information within nursery rhymes. And there's quite a few that I found out that has information like that. Rapunzel, the princess with golden hair locked in a tower. Who was the princess with golden hair who was locked in a tower in both biblical and Arthurian type history? Well, it was Queen Guinevere, of course, in Arthurian history, who was the princess who was locked in a tower. And of course, if you go into biblical history, Mary Magdalene is known as Mary of the Tower. And she always had golden hair, of course. She has orange hair if you look at any image of her. So Rapunzel is Mary Magdalene. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
Wow.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a story of the heliocentric pattern of the solar system. Snow White is the moon. She's the Snow White moon. And she's followed by the 7 planets, the 7 dwarfs that follow the moon around the ecliptic. And then, of course, as the moon approaches the sun, the evil witch puts a corset on Snow White and pulls it tighter and tighter and tighter, so she gets thinner and thinner and thinner, just as the moon does as the moon approaches the sun. It gets thinner and thinner and thinner until it dies. The moon dies, just as Snow White dies. But then she kisses the princely sun, because the sun is always the male sun god. The moon kisses the sun during a lunar eclipse. So they have a lunar eclipse, which, it gives you the diamond ring, they call it, the celestial diamond ring. They consummate their love in a solar eclipse. And then, of course, she comes back to life. The moon comes back to life. She gets fatter and fatter and fatter as she pulls away from the sun. And of course, that can only happen during a new moon. You can only get an eclipse during a new moon, when the moon approaches the sun. So the whole of Snow White is a story about, celestial movements of the sun and the stars.
Kind of adds more credence to astrotheology theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is just
Absolutely.
mind-blowing, man.
It's actually very creative if you think about it. You know how
It's genius.
it's amazing. Yeah.
And nobody knows about it. Well, you know, I've been in masonry. I've been working at this for 40 years. This information doesn't seem to be out there, and I was very surprised that no one could see these connections. You know, especially in this Arthurian story, because I saw elements of this all the time when I was running through my work on the New Testament, because it just seemed obvious there were connections here. I mean, Merlin, you were talking about Merlin earlier. Who is Merlin? Well, Merlin is the Magi. He's the magician in the court of King Arthur. And who was the magician in the court of King Jesus? It was Simon Magus, Simon the magician.
Wow.
And he was the great magician from the New Testament. So he is the
Simon is Merlin.
Yeah, he is the Merlin character. And again, he's not that well known, but he's in the New Testament, he's in the Gospels, and he's even more in the there's some other texts, the Clementine recognitions. He's a famous character from the recognitions.
Okay, I thought you were going to mention something to do with the Nag Hammadi. Are you referencing Merlin?
No,
or
he's
Simon?
not. No, it's not Nag Hammadi. This is another text that has been known about from a long time.
It's called the Clementine. What?
Clementine recognitions. In fact, there's two of them. There's the recognitions and the homilies. It's the same story written obviously by a different scribe, but it's all about New Testament events. And it has this great debate, which is touched on actually in the Gospels as well, this great debate between St. Peter and Simon Magus, where they were debating, who was the true Messiah. And obviously, St. Peter was saying it was, the Christians, and Simon Magus was saying it was the Magi, that he was, Simon Magus claimed himself to be the Magi. But St. Peter said that he did miracles by the Spirit of God, and Simon Magus only did it by magic tricks. And that's the difference.
Okay.
They're exactly the same, of course, but one is magic and one is not.
Hey Rice, real quick, where are we?
Yeah.
Should we break for the first to break this up into two?
Yeah, I was thinking that I got probably a good another hour and 20 minutes that I can definitely do. And if Ralph, if you're good with that, we can just take a quick stretch and fill our cups back up and reconvene here in a moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is we're going to, as we just said, we're going to go ahead and break this up into two parts. So it will all be released at the same time, but we're going to go ahead and continue this part on from now.